we all have this idea in our head, and I think it's somewhat based on reality, which is um like we all love the idea of these old amps, these amps that we hear are the greatest amps, and we go on Reverb or something like a Princeton Reverb now of the era that you're trying to build a clone of. That thing costs between 36 and $5,000, which is is the most insane thing in the world to me, because I don't think it should be that much money. I mean, I would get a couple $1,000 is worth it for something old and cool, or maybe 2,500 bucks. And I guess there was a point where they were that much, but it's like, man, it just seems like a lot of money. Now, also, if you want to get yourself a really great clone of that amp, and I think I directed you to a couple places. One great guy, I think he's in South Carolina or North Carolina, is this company Headstrong, and they make great clones of all the old amps, like deluxe Fenders, all great clones of that stuff. And they're all like $3,200, $3,600 as well. So I think anytime you get somebody to like hand make something, it's gonna, it's 2024 and things cost money. And I just went to the supermarket, I went to Trader Joe's, and I'm like, how much is an avocado now? So it's like everything is expensive,
Yeah.
and so the pricing of everything reflects it, I think. So when you get this kit together, even though I suggested a few like kind of cooler premium parts, which some people would argue is not worth it, but I think it's kind of cooler and worth it. You're going to end up spending less than $2,000, well less than $2,000, and it's going to be this amp, if it's wired, if you do a good job, which you are good, and there's like it's wiring stuff, and if you look at the resources available to you online and talking to people like me and talking to people with some experience, you should make a killing little amp. So I think that's the main reason. It's like the economics of it. It's fun to do. There is definitely people fetishize the old stuff. So somebody, no matter what shape that old amp, that's the same Princeton Reverb that might be sitting next to yours, they're gonna be like, no, I like the old one better. And I've seen people do that with things where you give them a blind test, and you're like, then it's like all up in the air what they choose sometimes. If somebody does a good job of building a clone, and plus your thing will be quiet. It will be, old things are, and especially now, these amps are now they're like 60 years old. So a lot of the parts in there are not working anymore. The main thing that's the crucial part of the amp, in my opinion, and I think most people's opinion, is the transformer, what they call the iron. And the iron in that transformer that you got from this guy, Brian, I think it's Brian Sowers in Portland. They do such an excellent job, man. It's just like he really backwards engineered like how the old ones are made, and he does a killing job. And I got two amps I built. I built a little Princeton, the 50s version of Princeton would be a Tweed Princeton 5F2A. It's a model for that. And that amp, man, I mean, I built one in the past with other transformers that are a little more generic, and that sounded really good. I mean, no doubt, it sounded great. But the new one with this guy from Portland, Soursound transformer, I feel like it sounds a lot better. It's kind of noticeably better. So it's fun to have. It's fun to have that knowledge too, because I think, as you know, I mean, a lot of the stuff when you were like a youngster, interning with me, is like you learned a lot of stuff that you never would learn unless you had to do it every day. Like you learn, oh, this is what you do with an amp. This is what how you store this. This is how you do that. So you'll learn about how the innards of an amp works a little bit. So you'll be like, if something gets wrong on that amp. And also another thing is, these amps we're talking about are like hand wired. So inside there's a wire that goes to a pot, a volume knob, So it's a little bit more straight ahead than like if you look at the newer Fender reissues of these amps. They're not bad, and they're good for what they cost. They're good for $1,000 or $1,200 or whatever they cost. Hopefully that's all they cost. But they're really hard to work on because they're like these thin printed circuit board. And there's also a myth that circuit boards are bad, which is not true. There's some amps that are made with circuit boards that are newer amps that are amazing. Like, there's Sir makes amps with a circuit board, and they're great. And there's another company called Friedman that makes more Marshall style amps, and they're in LA. And those are made new style with a circuit board, but they're thick circuit boards with big traces. They're made awesome, and I would argue that they might be better in certain respects than the way a point-to-point wired thing is. So it just depends on your perspective, but those are the reasons, man. I mean, I think A, it's going to sound great. B, it's fun to do. C, you're going to save yourself some money, hopefully. And it's cool to like know it. It's cool to grab that knowledge. So I think that's sort of the main things I feel like it's nice about it. Because we talked, you and I were talking about, should I buy something? Should I do this? Should I do that? And there's a history to those amps specifically, the Princeton's, that is really neat. They're really cool amps.
For sure. Yeah, I
Well,
guess the
in
next.
terms of if you could just like half a step back, because I don't know the models or any of the history of like or what the options even are.
Yeah.
If you, I don't know how many there are floating around in your head. If it's an even
Okay, there's a bunch. I'll go back to the beginning. I'm not because I'm not. I mean, this information is obviously. If I mess any of this up, don't don't type an email to you guys or to me and go like, yo, what kind of information are you giving out?
No,
Off the top of my head, there's basically three. There's three, maybe three or four basic eras of the amp. The tweed amps, and there's different revisions of it. I think there's a 5F2A and a 5F2B. Then there's the brown version, I believe, that Princeton came out with, that Fender came out with, which is kind of like almost crosses the bridge between the black panel versions and the tweed versions. Now, to quickly describe it, I would say the tweed ones are more mid-range forward. They're also a smaller amp. It's a 4-watt amp. So it goes into distortion way quicker. It's got it's definitely more mid-forward. It's not scooped sounding. It's more aggressive. It goes into distortion quick. It's got a really classic sound. It's great. It's got what one would describe as a tweed sound, which is that mid-forward thing. Because of the box. And it also came with a smaller speaker. The original ones came with 8-inch speakers, which is great. I mean, you'd be surprised. Like I've done records for this guy we know. Simon and I both know him, and he's worked with you a little bit, even after we split apart from, you got into LA, I'm still in New York. Is Ben Yunsen. We did solos for his record on this little Princeton that I built, cranking it to all the way up, which is kind of comical. You can crank this up, and it's almost like you could talk over it. Almost. It's not. It's loud. It's really loud, but you're not like screaming or be heard. It's like. But it's a great tool too, and it's a real dead simple amp to build and relatively cheap. I would suggest that'd be a fun one for you to approach, especially if you get like, if you're feeling good about what you've done now. If it comes out good and easy, you'll be like, definitely build another one. That's a fun candidate. But so the next era is brown ones, which is sort of like it's in between. Now the tweed one had no reverb. I believe the brown one note had no reverb as well. I forget if it had tremolo or not. That we'd have to look up. Because I've never even seen a brown Princeton in person. I might be wrong about it existing, but I think it existed. And then there's another era that had, I believe, a black panel amp with white knobs, and that was slightly different. But the classic era we know is the black panel era, and that's from '64 to '68, maybe early '69, but that's the era. And if that means the black panel, the front panel where the controls are black. And that's very known for its like, if there's a specific circuit, I think it's I might be wrong about this. Somebody has to fact check me. You can do a little thing on the bottom if I'm wrong. I think it's an AA674 or 673 circuit. Now, whatever that circuit is, that circuit's been in, that's the same circuit. I think it's in tweed, that's not in tweeds, that's in black panel Princeton, deluxes, almost all the different black panel era amps with slight changes. Like certain amps had mid controls, certain amps had bigger. The difference is big difference is the power sections. The power sections of a Princeton is only two 6V6 tubes, so you're getting about 12, maybe 14 watts out of that amp. And then a deluxe had a bigger transformer, or maybe the same output transformer, I think, but it did 22 watts. And then you have like other amps above that, like, pros and different things, and Reverbs, which are all essentially the same circuit. So black panel amps, for the most part, I would say, just to cover myself, because I think it might be almost all of them, were that circuit. The other thing about the circuit is it had reverb and tremolo. So in the amp we're talking about, like the black panel Princeton Reverb you're building has reverb, and that's a great sound. And it's got tremolo, which sounds great as well. The brown era amps had different style tremolo. It had a biased tremolo, I believe, and this one is different. This one is more, the one in the black ones, I would say sound a little bit more choppy and less modulated than the ones previous. Then I would say the next era after that, I mean, it goes on a little bit after this, but this is, I mean, the significant parts that are more interesting is then there was a silver panel amp. So Fender sold themselves in 1965 to CBS, the Broadcasting Network, which is really odd. And the quality started going down on Fender stuff slowly, but it started going down, and eventually it went down a bunch. But the next 3 years of the amp, 65, 66, 67, and part of 68, I think, they were still black panel amps. They changed slightly maybe near the end, but they didn't really change much. And then the first thing came was the silver panel, front panel amps. And those were 68 to 70, I think maybe 1980 they were built, maybe 79, something like that. But into the 70s. And those amps, same kind of configuration. They had, reverb trem. They started changing a bunch of stuff in it. The circuit changed slightly that people think it doesn't sound very good. But if we talk more about the Princeton, it's really interesting because we all fetishize these older amps, these Princeton Reverbs, the black panel ones. That's the ones that cost $5,000, $4,000 on reverb and stuff now. And the later amps are not as coveted, but they were really good too. They weren't bad. I mean, I thought they sounded good. And ironically, I think if we talk about what's cool about these amps and who used them, it's like, I mean, there's a guy named Louis Shelton, and he was a session dude in the late 60s, 70s in I think LA. And maybe also Detroit, but he was definitely a lot of Motown. So all that Jackson stuff, like ABC, I think all those songs, that was a silver panel Princeton. So it's like we get all these, everybody, I think it's the same if you're a DJ, people say, oh, this is the only turntable, or this is the only thing. But then you go see somebody do their thing and you're like, wow, they're not using that. They still are doing a great, amazing job. So that's the basic history of it. The amp was basically, I don't want to say unchanged, but changed, but still a great amp from like the mid 60s, 64 to like late 70s. And that's the amp we know as a sort of classic Princeton Reverb. The real super classic era, I guess, is that era, the early, 64 to 68. And then 68 has its own category, and then beyond 68, it's another category. We can get into some minutia here. I don't know.
Oh, there's 65 on the kit.
Yeah, so this one's the 65, the black.
Yeah, it's that classic era kit, and you got the classic, and that dude does the classic era. Brian Sowers does the classic era output transformer, and the key is sort of the output transformer, to that. And
that's one of the things that it's like a mod, right? It didn't come with the kit. You had to buy a different piece for the output transformer.
Yeah, I mean, Simon and I talked about it, and because I'm kind of a picky dude about stuff, there's nothing wrong. First, he bought the kits from this company, Mojitone, which is an amazing company, and they offer amazing products. So I love them. But if you want to get a little bit, like my friend uses the term, like cork sniffery about it, like some wine experts, you can be a little picky. And that's me sharing my pickiness with Simon about those transformers. I think it makes a difference. And sort of like the coupling caps, I also made a suggestion to maybe change those out. And I always talk to people. I brought this amp in because it's something a little bit over my head to fix on an amp I have in Nashville now that I moved here. And I brought it to a dude here who does a lot of amps, a company called Through-Tone. And the guy's name there is Justin Butler, I think. And he's a great dude, very knowledgeable, does a great job in vintage amps. And he was just saying sort of the same thing, like, oh yeah, those blue caps from Sozo that are like kind of like that black panel era Fender style capacitor, those really are legit and they sound better than, the ones you get in a kit usually. So there's levels. I mean, some people get to the point where like all the resistors in that kit are new resistors, new of the old style. They're carbon film resistors, and they're inherently a little bit noisier, but they supposedly have a tone that is good. I would argue that a lot of the parts in there, and I don't want to like melt your brain too much, but you could have replaced with like half of those parts, those resistors, with modern resistors, and I bet you anything you wouldn't have heard a difference. There's like only 2 or 3 spots in that amp where the carbon film resistors matter a lot, in my opinion. And I can't tell you what they are because I know where they are and what they look like, but I don't remember what they're called. But they're the part of the amp that the resistors actually see a lot of voltage. Because it's, I think from what I understand, the carbon film resistors in that amp that see a lot of voltage, that's when the carbon filmness of them, the quality that we like, becomes apparent. So that's a thing. But yeah, man, I think, what you got going there though is going to sound great. It's going to be really fun.
I had a couple other questions lined up. I guess you covered a lot of the stuff. Oh yeah. Okay. So, um, okay, so there's like two or three more main categories. I guess let's do the easiest one first.
Speakers?
No, no, that's one of the
That's the
layer.
hardest one.
Yeah. The easiest one is the cabinet. Why? What is it? What are the original cabinets made out of, and why is it important?
I believe I'm actually pretty sure that the original cabinets were made of pine, and then the baffle was birch plywood, but thinner. It wasn't like a quarter inch. I think it wasn't like half inch. It was like 3/8 inch. I think you'd have to double check me on that. Um, and pine it has a sound to it. It's a little bit more resonant. I would equate, especially I noticed this especially in the tweed amps. Like I've tried tweed amps into other cabinets. And I would almost say like the tweed ones, really the pine cabinets and with the birch ply baffle, um, it's sort of, the baffle is a floating kind of baffle, and you see how it is when you attach it. It's attached, but it's not like glued in. It's like held in with a couple of screws, and it's a floating baffle, and that changed over time. The pine thing has, I think, a more, especially in the tweed amps, I noticed this, a definite more resonant quality to it. It almost is like, it's almost like acts a little bit like the behavior that you would expect or would hear in an acoustic guitar or something. A cabinet actually makes that kind of difference. And it's an open big sound. It's an open back cabinet, which also gives you, like, if you put it against a wall or near a wall, the sound will come out the back and reflect off the wall and add to your volume. And it's not just coming from one place in a sense, but that's all the Fender stuff. They're all open back cabinets. They're not like a Marshall with a closed cabinet. So then they changed and they started making, I think the cabinets were still made out of wood, and I think they might have still made out of pine, but at some point they changed the baffle to particle. And that was really stiff. Now you do the hi-fi thing. So I would like to hear what you think about that, because it's an interesting thing, because sometimes that particle board is really dense and really rigid, so it doesn't move. Now in a guitar amp, I think that's bad. It lacks a little bit of charm. Now, if you were to put a giant high watt speaker in it, like for example, if you get a deluxe reverb from the 70s with that particle board, that changed in the 70s. I believe they started using particle board then, and maybe even a little earlier. The resonance, if you put a big 200 watt speaker in your amp, or 150 watt of electro voice speaker, which was very popular amongst certain hard rock dudes and certain country dudes, because they wanted a really clean sound, as clean as possible for certain things. And if they wanted distortion, they flip on a pedal or something. That, I think the stiff baffle is okay. It sounds good for that, because it's sort of like holding stuff together a little bit. And again, this is all subjective too. You're gonna get people with different opinions than me, but that's just my anecdotal observation over the years, and I think that's a thing. So the pine cabinet is a thing. The thinner Void 3 Baltic ply, that's why they say you shouldn't just go buy a piece of plywood from the 3/8, if they have 3/8 plywood, which I don't know if they do at a Home Depot. Be wary, because that might have voids. And this is supposedly void free, so there's no like area with a knot that has a void and then that vibrates or buzzes. I guess that's just the fear of that. So that's the main thing. I think you're going to get more vintage correct open sound with that kind of cabinet, and I think that's the main reason. And you could do a mahogany cabinet, and it might be great, but it's not going to be. It's sort of like, I've had people go, I want to build this guitar like you have, that you put together. And I go, okay, here's what if you want it to sound like this, you have to use this, and this. And that's what I use. But then they go, well, I really thought about getting this bridge, and then maybe getting this, like these kind of tuning machines. And I'm like, well, you're moving away from what I did, so it's not going to sound the same. And it still probably won't sound exactly the same, but it's the devil is in the details of this stuff for sure. Every little bit matters, you know. I mean, Tyler, I was talking to Simon the other day, like we are texting about like, you know, power cables, like, you know, like, and some people think that's nonsense, but power cables on an awesome set of speakers, the power amps you use, it makes a difference. The speaker cables make a difference, you know.
Power's been the number one thing that I think is obvious when we make a good change where we hear the difference in the system.
Yeah, it's really shocking. It's a thing.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's surprising, man. People don't sleep on that a little bit, and I think it makes a difference. Now, do I think it makes 10 times the difference? No, and I think it makes no sense to put a fanciful power cable on a Princeton Reverb amp if you want it to sound like an old Princeton Reverb amp, because that's what they had. I mean, a lot of times when people made speaker cables back in the day, like if you had a Marshall head and you went from your Marshall head to your Marshall cabinet, they would go down to the hardware store and buy lamp cord. They would just get a cord that you'd use if you fixed a lamp back in the 60s and 50s and 70s and stuff. So it's a trip. Like, it's this thin line. Like, am I trying to make this better, or do I want it like it was? You know, it's sort of like that kind of thing.
I like that phrase you used, vintage correct. I'm gonna keep that one in mind. That was good.
Yeah, I mean, it's like vintage correct. I mean, it's sometimes that's awesome, and sometimes that's just a little bit of. I say this, that everything does make a difference. Everything you do will make a difference, but will you be able to hear that difference? That's the key. Will you be able to hear that difference in a mix? I mean, then again, we're going down the scale. We're like, oh, nothing matters. It doesn't matter. But I mean, this is what we love. We love this stuff, right? We all love this stuff. You love audio. So when you're like, stuff sounds great, you're like stoked, you know, you want it to sound great. So it's fun, you know, so.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I guess we got two more categories. One we've talked about a little bit, and one we talked about quite a bit, and one we haven't. But first is to recap on tubes.
Okay, that's a tricky one, especially these days, because if it was like 10 years ago, especially before the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of tubes. The tubes are available to you. You had two choices. You could get tubes that were vintage, and as time goes on, the problem with the vintage tubes is what's left has been sort of picked over. And so there's stuff that's awesome, that works great, that we know that has been vetted and tested properly and works great. That's disappearing as time goes on. And there was a time where tubes were made in their countries they came from. Usually, like the U.S. they made tubes, you know. And I was born like in 1969, so I remember as a little kid going to the like the drugstore, and when you went to check out, there was a little rack, like where you'd see the Altoids and stuff now. There's a little, or batteries or something. There's a little rack that had tubes. So, because you'd have, if your mom and your grandfather, you had a tube, you'd have a TV in your house. If it was 1971 and 72, those TVs in your house were tubes. There were vacuum tubes in there. Your stereo was vacuum tubes. So that was a thing. So I think what's happening is those vintage tubes made in the USA, made in England, made in Germany, they were amazing tubes and the quality was great. And there was a reason for it because they were used everywhere. And back then, definitely, I think quality mattered more. I mean, I think the trend of the 21st century is sort of like, we're good with like, you know people that are like, you go to your grandfather's house or your great grandfather's house, or whatever, and you're like, at this point, it's getting to be great grandfather's house. And, you know, there's like some coat he's got that you could like take that and like, I'll wear this because it's great. It's still awesome. It's made awesome. So I think that's the whole idea of quality was a thing that was very important back then. And also the weird thing is like, there's some tubes I sent you a link the other day to a site that sells tubes. And I was looking at one of the versions of, and you might have seen them, of these 6v6 tubes. They're normally a 6v6 tube, a new one goes for about maybe $40, something like in that area, plus or minus, right? And they had some 6v6 tubes that were from this company called Bendix, and they go for $250 a piece. And the reason is that company, I think they're out of New Jersey, and somebody could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was New Jersey. They made the tubes that went into the intercontinental ballistic missiles that were for the US Air Force, like to bomb Russia and stuff. So those tubes were like amazingly of highest quality, or you don't want that missile landing in like Amsterdam instead of Moscow. So you have to make sure those tubes were like great in them, and those tubes are great. I actually heard a pair of those tubes in a deluxe amp, and it was shockingly good sounding. So it's interesting. Those old tubes are great. Now what happened now is, since that happened, the people who had those machines, because especially Russia, because Russia was dragged into the 21st century after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they had tons of tube machinery. And those to make tubes, and so did China. And they were sort of slow too. I mean, they obviously picked up their game a lot, since they make every single device we use now. But those machines are still in those countries, and those are the only significant manufacturers of tubes today. I mean, there's maybe somebody's going to, no, but this guy makes tubes, or this one guy makes tubes. This one company makes tubes in the US, and they do. There's a couple of US companies, but they're really expensive. And they're made for certain hi-fis. And I forget, they're like 300B tubes, and they're like $400 each or $300 each. They're massive amounts of money. But if you love your hi-fi, you just spend $70,000 a pair of speakers. I mean, I guess, $500, $600 for a tube is not going to kill you. But so then the next thing that happens is all these tubes, they start finding their way into American stuff because they're cheap. And so there's thousands of these. If you're a Fender or somebody, you buy 1,000 tubes, you put your little label on it, and then you silk screen your label on it, and then you start popping these tubes and amps, and there's a failure rate. I mean, there's a huge failure rate in these newer tubes. So Fender hopefully catches most of it, and they might buy 100 tubes, and maybe 70 of them are cool. And that's sort of what happens. And I'm guessing, so I don't know. But I'm in my experience of buying newer tubes, my failure rate has been like 80% successful. Like 2 out of 10 tubes at least are fishy. Like they're noisy, or they are microphonic. Like if you tap the side of an amp, you hear this rumble, this weird sound. So that's the thing. So Russian tubes are big. There's a guy in New York, there's a company called Electro-Harmonics that have been around forever. They made the fuzz face, they made the small clone, they made all these cool effects pedals. And then he branched off. The guy's name is Mike Matthews. And he started buying the names. Like he bought Mullard, he bought Genelec, he bought all these old school, the old vintage names, and he makes tubes in Russia using those names. And for what I understand, they're somewhat built the way they used to be built. At least the design of the tube is similar in most cases. And in some cases, they're not really that, but they're not like the old tubes. They don't have the same charm, and they don't have the same sound. And then there's another company that's really popular now. It's this company called JJ. And my experience, they make the most reliable power tubes. This has been my experience. They make 6v6s like the ones you're going to be using in that Princeton Reverb. They don't sound exactly like an old 6v6 at all. They sound almost like a 6L6. They sound burlier and more powerful, and a little less personality. They don't break up as easy. That's been my experience. But if I were a gigging musician, I'd probably buy those tubes because I could use them and not be afraid to retube my amp with those tubes. So that's a thing. I mean, there's a whole lot to discuss about this stuff. But basically, I gave you a couple of names of this one dude on eBay who goes to swap meets basically in Northern California, and he buys like a little radio that somebody has for like $25, and he noticed, oh, there's two 12AX7 tubes in there that are worth $100, maybe $50-$60 each. So boom, that's my cost for getting these tubes, are $10 a piece of a vintage tube. So he's one dude, and he tests the tube. So that's why I gave you his name. Every tube I bought from him has been good. I suspected one was bad, and I emailed him and I was like, yo, I think one of these are bad. And he was like, just send it back to me, no worries, just let me know. And then I tested another amp, and it was like actually fine. It was the amp that was messing up. But there's people out there that are reputable, so you have to be worried about that when you're buying tubes. It's like reputable dealers. There's another dude in I can send you a link to. He's in Arizona, who's awesome. You could ask him like, I want a tube that sounds like a certain way, and he's like, well, this tube is going to be more mid-rangey. I got these 3 old Sylvania tubes. I plugged them into a thing, and they have this more burly low end. It's like he's like really into it, and he's real helpful. And there's people like that. So you got to just be. It's almost like really right now is buyer beware, because it used to be like those Chinese tubes were really bad. You'd want to avoid Chinese tubes. I think there's a factory. I think it's called Xingdong or Xinggong factory. I might be pronouncing this completely wrong. And they used to make they made tubes for a while, and they got reorganized somehow. And now their tubes are kind of dope. They're really good. Like a lot of people use Marshalls, like their tubes, and the quality has come up. So I think a lot of these vendors are responsive to what people want and their reputation, especially now, is like somebody's going to call you out on Instagram or on Facebook and social media and stuff. It's like you want to make sure your stuff is kind of good because the word will get out quick. But it's just buyer beware. You're gonna run into some bad ones, and it's always good. Like when you finish this amp, it's always good to get a whole complete new set of tubes, just in case, And I've got like literally like one of those container store alpha system things with a deep bucket that's like this big full of tubes that are just like extra things, So,
A good dealer with the old tubes from Russia or the former USSR, is that what you want to be looking
no,
for?
I want American tubes.
For the
I
US,
want old American tubes,
That's
but those are harder to come by,
I
and
see.
they're very expensive. The Russian or Chinese tubes were always like ones I feel. And again, somebody's in my house chime in, like, no, they're these things I got and they're great. And that might be the case. But my experience has been like, I think the classic American tubes from Sylvania, RCA, those companies have been like the best tubes, man. They're great,
Nice.
almost without saying,
I'm gonna run out of time on the Zoom, and when I quit, it's gonna make me convert the video. But let me do that, and then in like, I don't know, probably 20 minutes, I'll call you back and we'll talk about speakers, and that's kind of it.
All right, that sounds good. Cool, dudes.
Thanks,
All
man.
right.
Thanks.
All right, bye now.